everything sound a little spookier today? Like all the music? I realized this week as I listened to people calling into radio shows with real life ghost stories that my research for the sermon was going to cost me a little sleep. Right? There's some really spooky stuff out there. But I am not going to retell any of those very scary stories today from the pulpit, at least, so don't worry. But this morning I am interested in why we would ever want to hear or retell scary stories, and especially why is it that as a species, if not as individuals, why is it that humans are so enthralled by monsters? Big ones, small ones, terrifying ones, playful, friendly ones. There's lots of different kinds, right? And we go to the movies to see them. We watch movies about giant, unstoppable, prehistoric shark monsters, or about aliens or supernatural clowns. In Jordan Peele's movie Us, the monsters are doppelgangers of ourselves, destroyed by the difference between lives that are privileged and those of the underclasses. Peele is really good at turning cultural studies into horror. In his movie Get Out, the scary thing is hidden racism, which the characters who are people of color sense and are unnerved by, but which the film's white liberal characters pretend does not exist until they turn into deadly monsters. Linking monsters to culture is a time-honored tradition. According to monster theory, monsters reflect the fears of their times, and they change across eras and cultures and places as fears change. Monster theory. Yes, that is a thing. College students, it is not too late to change your major. It is for you, Jane, but everybody else, no. You might want to dual major in monsters theory and like poli-sci, political science. I think there could be some potential there. Zombies are another example. Several years ago, I preached about The Walking Dead, which is a zombie show that was a really big hit back then. And in that show, zombies cause a breakdown of society, like an apocalyptic breakdown of society. There have been lots of apocalyptic horror and sci-fi movies and books and shows produced over the last few decades. As real-life environmental and political crises grow in intensity, our collective imagination is drawn toward the kinds of monsters that lead to a radical disruption of human living. The word monster comes from the Latin word monere, which means to reveal or to warn. The same root word is found in the word demonstrate, right? Monster, demonstrate. So monsters exist to show us something, and we're drawn to them because they reveal or warn about something that is relevant, something that's probably already somewhere in the backs of our minds or in our psyches. Stephen Asma is a guy who is a professor of philosophy, science, and religion at Columbia College in Chicago, and he is considered an authority on the history and philosophy of monsters. Side note, if you Google his image, sometimes he looks like a young Vincent Price, like complete with the mustache. I think that we should invite him to Albuquerque because he seems really fun. Anyway, Asma suggests that imagining monsters allows us to imagine how we would meet our foes, or how we would deal with those things that scare us so much. One of the things humans are scared of, and this is a timeless one, is the unknown. So monsters are often hybrid characters. Like they don't fit neatly into one category. They're dead but not dead. They're human but not human. They might be like minotaurs, combinations of different animals. They're undefinable, kind of unknowable, and this is one of their essential characteristics. Humans are also really scared of being helpless, so monsters are often excessive. Like they're very big, very strong, or very fast. Think King Kong, for example. And when we call something monstrous, that we usually mean large in size. Monsters are also often excessive in the sense of seeming or actually being unstoppable. Stephen Asma says you can't bribe them, you can't reason with them. A monster is something that you just can't ameliorate, classically, something you can't make better. Sometimes we call really violent people monsters. Their behavior is so abhorrent as to seem inhuman, and when we use that term in that way, it also tends to have that terrifying kind of connotation of unstoppability or being out of control. Can't be reasoned with. There's a Babylonian creation myth called the Enuma Elish, which we think is probably about 4,000 years old, so really old. And in it, Tiamat is the mother of creation. She represents the formless chaos from which life and the cosmos and all the order emerged. She, Tiamat, is depicted as a monster who rages and roars. The scripture says she set up vipers and dragons and more monsters, and hurricanes and raging hounds and scorpion men and mighty tempests and fish men and rams. Her commands were mighty, none could resist them. Very classically monstery. Most of the story after that is about the other gods' efforts to conquer Tiamat. So it's the story of life coming from nothingness and people's fear of returning to nothingness, like needing to battle that. The nothingness is depicted as really ferocious because humankind loves life so much. There are monsters in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures too. There is Leviathan in the book of Job, a creature unlike any other. The scripture says Leviathan's snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream out of its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. It's invincible and unstoppable. It says arrows and swords can't hurt it. And then before that, in the same story, the scripture mentions Behemoth, another monstrous creature. And we use that word now commonly just to refer to something that's very large. It's trickled into regular vocabulary. Okay, here's one more example from the Hebrew scriptures, which I really like because it is so descriptive. It's from Ezekiel, in which the scripture speaks of cherubim, like cherubs, like babies with wings, right? Wrong. No, that's from art. Babies with wings are from art. Here's what the scripture says those cherubim are. I quote, "Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels," the scripture says. "Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One was that of a cherub, the second the face of a human being, the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle." These are angels of God. Historically, our ideas about God and our ideas about monsters have been very much connected, as you can see in these ancient scriptures. So here's a secular example, and it's the story of Frankenstein by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, one of our great classics. She wrote this story in the year 1818 when she was a brand new mother, and she was just 18 years old. That's when she wrote a classic novel that has endured for 200 years. It's credited with being the very first sci-fi novel as well as being a horror story. And it's written as a story within a story. And if you have never read this actual book, Frankenstein, but you've only seen the movies or the pop culture references that have spun off from it, you'll probably be really surprised at how much nuance and insight it contains, both about the time in which it was written and about those timeless issues of the human condition, and then also about this very time that we find ourselves in today. The story starts on a ship in the Arctic Sea, from the point of view of Robert Walton, who is a man that has left Europe behind to go in search of a northern passage through the Arctic ice. Walton wants to be a famous discoverer, and he will stop at nothing. He is chasing this dream, even though there's a very real possibility it will cost himself and his crew their lives. So he and the crew are up there in the Arctic Sea. They're navigating a bunch of icebergs when off in the distance, they spot an enormous figure, human-like, except extraordinarily tall, driving a sled across the ice. They don't believe they're anywhere near any actual land. So this really startles them. And then a few hours later, another figure, this time a regular-sized man shape, also appears before their eyes. Now this man is scrawny and frozen. He and his sled are actually not even moving, but they're just stuck on a small chunk of ice that has broken off from an iceberg, and they are drifting along in the Arctic Sea, and that piece of ice is getting smaller. So he is at the brink of death, and Walton brings him on board his ship to rescue him. And when the man gets on board and he hears what this ship is about, he begs Walton to listen to his story before going any further. He wants to tell him a cautionary tale about the relentless pursuit of greatness and fame. And that man is named Victor Frankenstein. We forget that Frankenstein is not the monster. It's not the monster that was portrayed by, for example, actor Boris Karloff in the 1931 movie, the one with the kind of blockish head and a greenish tinge, right? With bolts in the neck. That image has become the main one that's associated with the name Frankenstein in our modern imagination. But in the book, Frankenstein is actually the man. He is Western literature's first mad scientist. He's from Geneva. This is the second week in a row we are hearing about Geneva. Miguel Serveto, Michael Servetus, was there last week, or in the 1500s. This story was written to take place in Mary Shelley's time, so this story takes time someplace around the early 1800s. Takes place sometime around the early 1800s. In real life, this era was the age of the Enlightenment in Europe. Science had just gotten legs under it. Have you ever seen that fish bumper sticker? There's like the regular fish, and then there's the fish with the legs, the sassier fish. Science was like that. Science was evolving in this era, and it had gotten legs under it. It was growing into a serious discipline, and it was changing the way people thought about the natural world and humans and religion and God and just about everything. Scientists were discovering new things all the time about how bodies and plants and the world work. And with that came this growing sense of power. The idea that if we could understand it, we could steer it or control it. And so a people whose creation story had taught that they were made in the image of God were getting a taste of the possibility that they could be like God in knowledge and power. Many of the old religious myths were headed right out the window. They were increasingly considered superstitious, ignorant, and outdated. In Shelley's novel, Victor Frankenstein is caught up in the power and in the imagination of that time. He's trying to escape his grief over the death of his mother, and he is obsessed with answering the ultimate question: how matter, how stuff becomes alive. So he travels to Germany, and shutting himself off from the grief and just focusing on his obsession, he shuts himself off from the natural world, off from friends and loved ones, and he holes up in a laboratory where he conducts all these grisly experiments, just one after another, until he finally figures out how to do it, how to spark life. And he decides he's going to make a creature of his own. He wants to create a new species that will worship him as its creator. He wants it to be magnificent, like better than a human. So he forms it from an assemblage of what he considers to be very beautiful parts. He assembles muscle and skin and bone, and he fashions it into this man-like creature that's over 8 feet tall and is built especially for strength and speed. But the moment the creature comes to life and opens its eyes, the "it's alive" moment. The moment that happens, Frankenstein is horrified, just horrified. He sees that this thing he's made is not beautiful at all, but it appears really unnatural, and it terrifies him, and he runs away from it. While he's away, the creature disappears. The creature is never given a name in the story, which might be why we confuse his name with the scientists. He's referred to as a creature, a demon, a fiend, a wretch, an ogre, and a monster. But I like creature because it sounds a little bit gentler. We're all creatures, right? And you know, he does not start out as a bad guy. He starts out all right. After he leaves the lab, the creature quickly realizes that it's not just his creator, but it's actually all people that are scared of him. And so he goes off and he hides in the woods. and he subsists on berries and acorns. He learns how to use fire to stay warm. He comes across a little cottage with a French family inside, and he learns to speak by eavesdropping on them. He observes how sweet they are to each other, despite having to work very hard and being very poor. And so with affection, he starts to secretly chop firewood at night and just leave it by their door, where they'll find it in the morning. He thinks if they see him, they'll probably become very frightened, and so he just stays hidden. But by watching them as they read, he watches through the windows, by watching them, he also learns to read. And then he comes upon a copy of Paradise Lost, the epic poem about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, written by John Milton. That poem is already 150 years old, by the way, when this story takes place. But the creature is fascinated by it and by the whole idea of an origin story. And so he starts to wonder about his own origins and why, unlike Adam and Eve, who had many descendants, there's no one else like him around. What am I? Where did I come from? He asks repeatedly. And soon he finds Victor Frankenstein's journal pages in the pocket of a garment that the creature had taken with him from the lab. And he hadn't realized what they were at first because he couldn't read, but now he can, and now he understands. You know, we forget that Frankenstein's monster was a French-speaking, poetry-reading autodidact who subsisted on acorns, but there he is, right? An autodidact is someone who's self-taught. He's a gentle fellow. The problem is that he is desperately, desperately lonely, and all he can think about is how much he longs for someone to look upon him with affection and care. But no one will. So when at last he musters up his courage to present himself to the cottagers that he has so tenderly watched and cared for, they respond with violence, and they run in fear, and they abandon their cottage forever. Now the creature is becoming angry. He is angry that he's been created for nothing but a life of suffering. He decides to find Frankenstein and hold him accountable, and he demands that Frankenstein make him a mate so that he is not alone anymore. It's the least he can do, having made a creature so lonely and rejected. And the rest of the story is a struggle between the creator and his creature. The creature makes his case in the most eloquent terms. He describes his heartache and his longing. He says he means no one any harm, his only goal is love. But Frankenstein responds almost entirely out of fear for this creature and out of shame, deep shame about what he has created. He's worried about his own reputation, and he curses the creature. The more callousness the creature experiences from others, the angrier he gets. And he threatens and kills Frankenstein's loved ones, trying to force him to make this companion. And Frankenstein vows to get revenge, and the two beings literally chase revenge to the ends of the earth, with the creature taunting Frankenstein to keep him in a perpetual state of wrathful misery, and the compassionless Frankenstein taking the bait. And that is how they wind up sledding across the ice, miles and miles away from land and community and any last shred of hope. Should I have issued a spoiler alert? I don't think we do that for 200-year-old stories. And anyway, I have actually left out many wonderful parts of this for the sake of time, and I recommend the story to you. There's a reason why it's still around today. This story has all the classic qualities of a good monster story. It reflects the concerns of its era. Mary Shelley had observed this movement away from emotional and spiritual wisdom and toward reason and logic. Her story of an inventor who's out of touch with his feelings, the grief, and who creates another being with no regard at all for its feelings is this cautionary tale about that era. Victor Frankenstein is spiritually and emotionally empty. He lacks humility, and he would make himself like a god. This monster warns, and it reveals, it demonstrates, right, the pitfalls of relying on a kind of knowledge that is divorced from the complementary insights of wisdom and feeling. It also contains universal, timeless themes of our fear of being powerless, of being rejected and lonely, of our lives being made unendurable by things that are out of our control. And in fact, throughout the story, it's the monster who experiences these things. And as Victor Frankenstein's callousness and his self-absorption are revealed, the reader begins to wonder, who is the real monster in the story? He's created terrible suffering for this creature, abandoned it. He cannot be reasoned with, Frankenstein, but he only makes the suffering worse, which leads more bad things to happen. And finally, although the Enlightenment seems like a long time ago now, in fact, probably we're at a point in human history that will be looked back on as still very closely connected to that era. We have discovered many things, but not everything. Okay, we still have new discoveries every day, all the time, happening. And concerningly, we have still not managed to effectively, consistently pair logic and science and technology with other kinds of wisdom. We have not been able to do that often enough. We birthed the internet without preparing for how it could become a boundaryless field for the worst human tendencies. We harnessed the Earth's natural resources without planning for the impact our actions would have on the web of all existence upon which our very lives depend. And we are on the cusp of an era in which artificial intelligence and genetic engineering are norms. The author of a book called Frankenstein, The First 200 Years, Christopher Flaling writes, "The real creation myth of modern times is no longer Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In the age of stem cells, genetic engineering and cloning, and cryogenic attempts at resurrection," he writes, "the real creation myth is Frankenstein." It's not to say that any of these things are bad inherently, in and of themselves, but it is to say that in every era, we do well to listen to our monsters. Right? They have important messages for us. In fact, we should think of them as friends.